So, yeah, welcome to the Django workshop, I guess I can say welcome to the jungle. I'm not sure if you've heard the song, but this is technically some puns around it. I think it was like we got puns and games, but now, yeah, changing that a little bit. So, the outline for today for the Django workshop are a couple of things. First is what are the REST APIs? What are REST APIs? What is Django? What is Django REST framework? And a little bit of the features of Django and some kind of things. Yep. So, yeah, let's go through it. Firstly, what are REST APIs? So, REST APIs are what you call representational state transfer, application programming interface. So it's basically, the simple way to put it is that it's a backend architectural patterns that follows these 5 main things. Get, to be able to get data. Post, to be able to create data. Put and patch, to modify or update the data. And delete, to delete the data. These are all interactions in server applications from the client-side application to connect to the database. So usually, a REST API conforms to what's called a Swagger or Open API specification. It usually looks like this. In the project, you're not going to be able to see this one, but when you go to the professional industry, usually, whenever REST APIs are built, there's going to be some form of documentation that says what error codes can be found at specific endpoints, what parameters do I need for a particular endpoint, and so on. So it kind of looks like this. So get, post, get, and also all the different patterns in the URL that you can have. Which brings us to the next slide. What is Django? So Django is a Python web framework for creating server-side applications. So it follows what's called the MVC pattern that we covered in the previous workshop, which has a model which is connected to the database. Django in particular uses Django ORMs. So it connects your server-side application to the database. You have view, which is the interface. And this interface can either be an application programming interface, API, or a user interface. It depends on what you use Django for, because Django can actually do front-end using some sort of templating, like Jinja, but it's usually used for just plain backend. But you can use it for front-end as well. You also have controllers, which is for URLs and also routes. This is what Django gives you in terms of its features. You have your ORM, URLs and views, templates, forms, authentication, admin, and also all sorts of things. Security. So, what is Django REST framework? So, as you might have seen in your the Waste project, is that it's a bit of a mix. You have Django and then you have Django REST framework. So Django REST framework is basically just a library for creating REST APIs. It just makes it easier, So it makes it easier in terms of 3 main particular things. You have authentication and permissions. You have generic API views. So I'm not sure about your background with APIs is the fact that there's a lot of things that are involved in just creating a simple API. Firstly, one thing that you might have is that you register the route, and then that particular route will call some function, will call a model function to get data, and then it will do some sort of serialization, and also all sorts of things that happens in between. So there's this manual process in terms of creating a new endpoints every single time. Django REST framework just streamlines that. It says that if every single backend that I have follows a particular pattern, it always has this 5 operations. Get, post, put, patch, and delete. So why not let's just connect that, connect a particular application into a database and serve all those 5 operations together. Because they're all generics, And one thing that we like about software engineering is that we don't want to repeat a lot of things. So Django REST framework just makes that all of it easier. But these are not the only features of Django REST framework. It can do much more. Here's the entire list. You can do such thing as throttling, for example. When you want to prevent brute force attacks on your particular endpoint or DDoS attacks, you use throttling. So you limit the amount of endpoints there are whenever interactions occurs. So yeah, there's a lot more here, but these are the three main things that it covers. Now let's go on to one of Django's important bits, the serializers. So what are serializers? They basically just a converter. They convert to and from Python data types to JSON and XML. So as you know, JSON and XML are particular data types that we interact with whenever we're dealing with front ends that are requesting data towards a backend. So here's an example. We have a comment, it's an object, and this object particularly has three fields: email, content, and created. So this is probably similar to what you've studied before, object-oriented programming. And to be able to create a comment, I have this class and then all the other fields that created with it. So that's a particular object type. You know, what if we want a dictionary, or what if we want to convert this object into JSON so we can serve it as a data in the front end? So we can use such thing as a serializer. A serializer basically defines the data type that you may have. So as you know with Python is that it does not enforce whether this email actually follows a certain standard that it's an email. It could just be a string or a number for whatever it may be. There's no enforcer. So we have serializers that actually enforce that. So we define that email, the field, is an email field. And also all sorts of things like created. Created will be a datetime field. So here's the thing that you could do. You could use your serializer to convert your particular object to a Python dictionary. So in this case, I have this one, emails and also content. I turn it to a particular Python dictionary. It becomes this. Furthermore to this is the fact that if a certain data type does not conform to, let's say, email, this serializer will error out, which means that you can technically use your serializer to do data validations as well. So before you save anything to the database, you validate whether that data is even correct. So now, we've been able to convert it to a dictionary, but usually we want it to convert to a JSON to serve it front end. So this is what we do. We have a particular function here called JSON render that can render a particular dictionary to a JSON string format that we can use in the front end. The next important piece as well of Django is the database model. So I think I've shown this in a little bit much more detail in the MVC, wherein I was talking about how your model connects to a backend. So one of the most used backends or database for Django is PostgreSQL. But you know, it doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, SQL is SQL. You change from a PostgreSQL to a SQLite, or you change it to MySQL server, it won't really matter as much. You will always have this one, a model, wherein it's basically a translation of a particular function to raw SQLs. And then this SQLs gets used to query something in your database. For Django, usually, it's a representation of your database connection, or your schema. So here's an example for that I presented back in the MVC. So there's a particular model called task, and it has two fields: title, which is a character field, and completed, which is a Boolean field. As you know, if you've noticed a little bit about it, is the fact that it kind of matches what we had previously in the serializers. Which brings us to our next slides. Model with serializer. So, because the model already defined the structure of data, with REST framework, we can create our serializer based on our model. So it looks like this with inheritance. Serializers.model serializer. And we just specified the model. Now we have a serializer or a data validator for that specific model. Okay. Now we have routes with URLs. So one particular thing about backends is that the importance of the URL patterns, because that URL pattern is important whenever your front end is interacting with the backend, to get the correct data. So this one determines the URL of the route of the API and always starts with in the settings.py. The usual file name will be urls.py for every particular Django application that you have. So it starts with this line, root URL conf. You're going to see this in the settings.py that you have. And this one in particular will go to the configuration Django application and then .urls, so urls.py. So here's the example of it. So I have to react to do Django app, to do drf, urls.py. And this is the particular code that it's looking for. I'm not sure if it's readable in your bit, but basically there's three things here. You have the admin for Django admin. We'll talk about that later. We have the main API, and then we have just a simple front end for index.html. This is actually what we were talking about when we can have Django serve as front end as well. So now let's take a look at this in particular. Include API.urls. So kind of a similar structure to this one, API.urls. So this one, it goes to the folder of API and to the file URLs. And it goes to this one. This is all the endpoints of the to-do app. You have listing, you have detailed, you have create, update, and delete. So the main, the entire path of this, the endpoints are in here would be something like localhost, and then the port, and then /API, and then / what endpoint that you're looking for, or resource you're looking for. Okay, now let's get into one of the most important files in Django, which is the settings.py. So it determines the app defaults and also configurations, such as the time zone at which the endpoint date are going to be created at, the start of the URL, like what I said, your installed Django apps, I'm going to talk about that in a second, your middlewares. Middlewares are just technically functions that executes before your request happen. An example that would be logging. So let's say, for example, I want to get certain statistics of requests that are happening in my backend. I have some form of logging system. And yeah, I also have the default configs for environment variables. Not sure how much you've dealt with environment variables before, but it's usually just an environment equal to a certain thing. So what if you want a default? Like for example, I have my application that is running at port 8000, and I want it to default to a certain port number, 3500 for example, if I don't have any environment variables that are set. So that's that. You also get the database configuration right there. So what if I want a different database whenever I'm doing automated testing? Because usually you want your database to be separate from testing. That's an example. That's another example. And here's the example of the settings.py. We have the main application that's there. We have the database, some sort of password validation and all sorts of config, and also internationalization, so time zones and things. Now let's get into one of the interesting parts of Django, which is called the Django Apps, or how to package an app in Django. So Django Apps are kind of like a plugin system of Django. So here's actually an example that I used at FlutterOS, wherein we actually forked this repository. It's basically used for Microsoft SAML single sign-on systems, wherein I want to log in using Microsoft. So the way how it works is that I use a package manager to install this particular library. I import it, and then I use the URLs defined in that particular Django app. Take a look at this pattern. Django SAML auth.urls. I think this is quite familiar to the previous slide, wherein we had API.urls. So this particular Django app kind of plugin system allows you to get some certain libraries or certain things out there in the web and use it as if it's your own applications. So this is what it usually looks like, and then you have to put your application in installed apps. Installed apps is also on the settings.py. So now you know about how to use a Django package. Now, how do we create one? So as you know, Django follows a specific pattern wherein we have this one, like for example, we have our project name and then all sorts of configuration files, settings.py, urls.py, manage.py, all the Django boilerplates, and we have this particular example wherein we have Pulse as a Django app. It's going to have a certain couple of files. So when I say usual files, it's going to be the models.py, for example. There's going to be the urls.py, test.py, views.py, and all sorts of things. So usually, you add the app in the installed apps, and you're going to run these two commands. If you're familiar with Flash, this is actually the same, wherein whenever you're registering a database model, you're going to have to run python manage.py make migrations. What it's going to do is that it's going to look at these installed apps, and then it's going to traverse all of the files here, look for a particular folder, and then look at the models.py. That's how it finds all your database connection. So when you do make migrations, it creates this file. So this folder and this file. Migrations init 001 initial. So 001 initial is basically the version of your database things. So let's say, for example, in my to-do app, what if I added a new field? I said, what's a new field? The user that actually created it. So I'm going to have to do migrations, which affects the database that I currently have. Because usually, when you're doing production systems, you're going to have data that is already have the database that already has data in it. So maybe like a couple of rows there, 1,000, millions. But I want to change this database to accommodate my new change. This python manage.py, make migration, actually automatically generates the correct SQL commands to do the migration for you. So that's actually one of the interesting bits about Django models as well, is that it creates the SQL for you to do migrations. And then after creating the migrations, you do a migrate. It runs the SQL scripts for migration to make the change compatible in your database. Next is the Django Admin. So the reason why Django is quite popular, especially for simple applications as well, is the fact that it comes up with a simple front end for you already. It's what's called Django Admin. So built-in user interface for managing Django apps with models.py. And this is actually what it looks like. As you've seen in the urls.py in one of the previous slides, you have /admin. This is where it goes to. And there's already a built-in login system for it as well. So this is what it looks like. You're going to have user groups and permissions. And these are all your Django apps. In this particular example, there's 3 Django apps, or 3 folders that you're going to find the code base: items, online, and stores. And each of those models.py, so for items, it's going to have 3 classes defined in models.py. For this one, it's going to have 1. Stores, it's going to have 2 entries in the models.py. So these are some of the patterns that you're going to see. Okay, PyTest demo. Let's leave that up in a second because I don't have, this is not my laptop. Let's talk about Postman. So Postman is a development tool for interacting with APIs. It has environment variables, you can have collection of possible endpoints, and you could also send different JSON bodies. So as you know, with backends is that you have to have some certain development tool to send or create HTTP requests. You can do that with JavaScript and also a lot of the client-side programming language. However, it's not that intuitive. But the way how we really want to just interact with HTTP requests is this thing. We just want to specify a URL and then probably send an HTTP request. That's the simplest bit for GET requests. Well, how about for POST requests? We usually change this to POST, have the URL there, we change the body, and then send. You're going to always see something that looks like this. So Postman is just a development tool that makes it simpler, and also the fact that you could select different already existing POST requests or GET requests that you already set up.